Well, shifting gears here now to something that's happening right here in DC. Almost every teenager in America is, of course, on social media. According to U.S. Surgeon General advisory released last year, 95% of teens aged 12 to 17 are using a social media platform, with more than a third saying they use them almost constantly. Well, now social media CEOs are on Capitol Hill once again answering questions about child safety online, with Senator Lindsey Graham starting the hearing with some tough words for Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg. Let's listen.
Mr. Zuckerberg, you and the companies before us, I know you don't mean it to be so, but you have blood on your hands. You have a product. You have a product that's killing people.
So where do social media companies go from here? Well, joining us now on this is Matt Perault, UNC Tech Policy Professor and former Facebook Public Policy Director. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. So we want to really, of course, set the scene here about what we're covering here, because it's not just about child safety, it's exploitation, it's about predators, it's about data being scraped from children aged 13 and under. What is going to be different this time? This isn't Meta's first time in this position.
I'm not sure that anything is going to be different. Their companies have come before Congress numerous times. Every time they've come before companies, the legislators have talked about how now is the time for action. And yet, despite that rhetoric, we really haven't seen much activity, at least at the federal legislative level, over the last couple of years.
Matt, that's not necessarily a good starting point when you consider this is a hearing that's still going on, right? I mean, you've got all the major CEOs testifying here. There is an inherent conflict, it appears, between the model that social media companies have versus the safety aspect of it. Do you agree with that thesis that essentially these algorithms that these social media companies are built on sort of play into these very concerns that lawmakers are trying to address today?
So I'm not sure I agree with the framing of the question. There are kids on social media platforms, and kids have lots of positive experiences and there are positive use cases for kids in social media. There are also harms, and those harms should be mitigated both by the platforms and by legislators. It does not seem to me like we have had much activity and we have much hope for future activity from Congress. We're in an election season. In election season, Congress does not take significant action typically. But what we have seen is a lot of activity at the state level. So last year, there were 0 bills, I think, passed in Congress that would regulate the tech sector. 0. But states passed about 65 in areas that are center tracked in a recent report on issues like artificial intelligence and privacy, content moderation. And the lead issue actually in 2023 in state legislatures was child safety. States passed about 23 bills. There were across 13 states. And so this was an area of significant activity at the state level. And I think we can anticipate that that will likely happen in 2024 as well.
And Matt, we know that a number of different companies, CEOs from X, from TikTok, Snap, Discord, but of course, Meta getting the bulk of the attention because of the being sued by 33 states. So, but with that in mind, then, when you don't have sort of any sort of set federal regulations that really cover everything, and you have this sort of piecemeal approach from states, how difficult does that make it for something like social media, which is essentially borderless?
Well, so I think that's yet to be seen. I mean, first of all, there are 13 states that have passed legislation in this area, but that leaves a large number of states that have not. And so in those other states, there currently are no on the books protections in this area, at least explicitly related to online child safety. And I think you're right to point to the possibility of a patchwork of rules across states. And that's not good, I don't think, for companies that have to deal with lots of different compliance regimes, but it's also not good for users. I live in North Carolina. I have kids in North Carolina. The rights that I have as a parent and the rights that my kids have as potential users at some point of social media, I don't think they should change when we drive from North Carolina to Virginia and we cross the border.
Matt, you mentioned the legislation we've seen at the state level. You know, they range from setting a minimum age for some of these platforms to requiring parental consent. Are there any in particular that you have seen from the state at the state level that you think have a lot of muscle in addressing this very issue about child exploitation?
So the question about solutions is a really, really hard one. This is an issue, I think, where there is a lot of unity amongst parents and amongst lawmakers that there is a challenge that we should address in some form. And as a parent, I feel a lot of sympathy with that perspective. I think the question is, how do we do it in a way that is respectful of kids' rights to free expression and respectful of kids' privacy? And that is really difficult to do in practice. It's extremely difficult. If you just take the baseline issue of how, in order to protect children, we need to know who is a child. That's actually really difficult to do in practice. You can do things like require individuals to submit identification, but that then means that social media companies are collecting a lot more data about who their users are, including potentially collecting sensitive data like actual identification. And so even that baseline issue of just figuring out how do we identify who's a kid and who's not is really challenging. And so that's why I don't envy the position that lawmakers are in, where there's just an acute interest in addressing this issue, but the solutions are really, really difficult.
And we did hear a ranking member, Senator Graham, talking about Section 230, which essentially protects social media companies from getting sued from some of the content that users post online. Now, that came out in 1996 when about 40 million people were using the internet, currently looking at about 5 billion people online. So in terms of the progression of how some of these social media companies have evolved, is perhaps revoking or adjusting Section 230 the way to do it? Because we are seeing this unwillingness to really self-regulate in a way that's making a meaningful difference, especially when it comes to the mental health of children.
Yeah, so I think Section 230 is actually really important here in providing some of the protections that I think lawmakers want. I mean, first of all, it protects it makes it less likely that social media companies will censor users, and that's an issue that's really important to conservatives. And it also really makes explicit that social media companies have the ability to moderate content on their platform, and that's an issue that's particularly of interest to Democrats who want to make sure that tech companies take action to address harmful content. So I think social media, I think Section 230 is likely more part of the solution than part of the problem. Our center at UNC has partnered with Lawfare and Slate to publish a list of all the 230 proposals that have been introduced in Congress over the last couple of years. And so if anybody wants to check that out, they can go to that website just to see the catalog of different approaches that lawmakers have used. I think the thing that is a little bit challenging in discussions in this area is that lawmakers beat the drum on this, but they don't actually take action. And again, we're in an election year, so I don't think we're likely to see much action in the coming months.
Finally, Matt, a question that may be a bit cynical here, but when you look at a company like Meta, a publicly traded company, profits haven't necessarily taken a hit as a result of all these concerns that have been raised. Shareholders aren't necessarily responding to what's the research and studies that have come out. At what point does this, as in the concerns around harms on users, at what point does that become a business concern for a company like Meta? Or is it already, even though that's not necessarily reflected in their financials?
Well, I think that has actually been reflected in some companies' financials. I mean, Meta's stock price is up right now, but it went through a long period of a slumping stock price in the wake of the Frances Haugen disclosures related to a whole bunch of different issues, but I think including that one. We certainly have seen X face significant challenges when there's been the perception that they've underinvested in trust and safety, and that has resulted, some allege, in advertiser flight away from that platform. So I do think that we actually have seen companies perceive this as a business issue. I also think it's important to recognize that it's not just Mark Zuckerberg who is testifying today, even though he's the person on the screen right now. It's a range of different platforms, and those platforms also have an interest in having strong experiences for kids online, which I think means including kids in those online experiences, not censoring them entirely or preventing them from having access to social media platforms that people of other ages have. But also, I think there is a responsibility to protect them, but hopefully to do it in a way that allows for a diverse set of companies. And so there are companies who are testifying today that haven't testified before, like Discord and Snap, for instance, or at least their CEOs haven't testified. And I think it's important to hear from them as well about the range of things that they do to protect kids online, and then also the unique experiences they have with dealing with some of these compliance challenges. It's typically the case that smaller companies actually can devote fewer resources to complying with a whole patchwork of different rules across state lines. And so their voice here, I think, is important for thinking about solutions that will work not just for the Metas of the world, but also for the smaller platforms.
And Matt, obviously, a lot of headlines were made when distorted and deepfaked images of Taylor Swift were circulating all over X. It did take a while for those images to come down, but it does speak to this issue of if someone as big as Taylor Swift, it can take a machine of her fan base to get some content moderators to pay attention. If you're an average person, as Lindsey Graham was saying at the beginning, having some of these compromising images online, what can people do to protect themselves? As some of these issues, some of these protections are not built in. You have to opt into them, especially if you're a young person.
This is a really difficult set of issues, and I think people face a range of challenges in the relationship they have with tech companies. I do think it's important that they understand the settings that are available to them. I think your point is spot on. That can be really hard to do. It can be complicated. It can be in the weeds of various different companies' settings offerings. But I do think it's important for people to figure out the settings that work best for them and the usage that works best for them and that gives them a positive experience. I think that's the kind of thing that we need to educate people about and to promote good specific tactics for digital citizenship and digital health.
Always appreciate your perspective there, Matt Perault, UNC tech policy professor and former Facebook public policy director. Thanks so much.
Thank you.